Yo, this hot, this the spot, there it is pod.com. We're interviewing the best comedians, so tune in quick and get your ears receiving them. We talking about life and life to stream right to you, from the microphone right to your home, dude. Side note, this might get embarrassing, but no, don't sweat, yo, cause there it is.
Welcome to the There It Is podcast, America's podcast, where we talk to interesting people. I'm your host, Jason Farr. Let's do this. Great episode today. We have actor, writer, director, comedian Boris Khaykin on. He's Ukrainian-born, so we start our conversation discussing what's going on over there, and we do have a link in the bio for ways you can donate to the relief effort in the Ukraine. The topic does shift after that discussion to things more lighthearted. Boris has a very unique perspective on everything we discuss. It's such a great chat. I can't wait for you to hear it. So why don't we just get right to it? Here's my chat with Boris Khaykin. It's such a weird time, especially like we're still kind of reeling from the pandemic, and then also Ukraine. Are you Ukrainian born?
Yeah, I am.
Oh wow, okay. Do you have a lot of family over there?
No, we have zero family over there. We have a friend, like my dad's childhood friend and his now adult son are still in Odessa, which is where we're from. Mm-hmm. And otherwise, I mean, everybody to like distant cousins that I can think of, as soon as, everything collapsed, everybody, some left a little bit before the collapse. I have some cousins that came here a few years before us. We came here in 91. And then basically between 91 and 98, all of my family that could get out went to either here or Germany or somewhere in Europe or Israel or basically anywhere. As soon as they could leave, they left. It's a complicated thing because my parents obviously have a much closer relationship with the country as a whole than I do. Right. I was 7 when we left. So I have more of an association maybe with the city that I'm from than with the country as a whole. But it's also a weird thing because we came as Jewish refugees. And so that kind of complicates it in the sense that Jews weren't treated great in the Soviet Union in general. And so it's one of those things where it's a love-hate relationship where obviously my parents especially care about the country and don't want to see this happening. And then they kind of jokingly were the one thing Putin accomplished is now they hate the Russians more than the Jews in Ukraine. He kind of turned the focus to somebody else.
Yeah, that's really complicated. It's there's some resemblance to being Black in America, where it's
very true.
I have more of a connection to America than I do Africa because I don't even know my ancestry, and I can't know my African ancestry. But yet also the reason I can't angers me so much. It's it's complicated. Those are complicated feelings I don't even know how to fully express.
Yeah, but that entered my mind as well, that there's definitely a parallel there between this is the country that probably more for you, America, than for me, Ukraine. For me, it's probably I'm closer to America being that country now, being the country that I, see as my country. But for my parents, probably it's more of almost a closer parallel where who they are as human beings is still, for the better or worse, very much related to this country. That, yeah, there's not amazing treatment and aspects to that.
Right. Well,
yeah.
To pivot here, I know it's a difficult and dark subject, but to pivot to comedy for a second, because you're an actor, you're a director, you do comedy, stand-up and otherwise, and you have been able to find ways to still create humor in regards to this subject. You had a funny tweet, it was so funny that even Justina, when she saw it, was did you see this tweet of Boris's? That was, as a Ukrainian refugee in America, I want to be abundantly clear that the best thing you can do at the moment is book me on your show. That got a lot of attention, that tweet. A lot of people liked that tweet.
I know I was a little surprised about how much that one took off, especially because I was almost worried about whether like the irony was clear, only
Right.
because my dad texted me about it, and my parents are very supportive of my comedy and have a good sense of humor, and I think maybe they didn't quite see the irony, and they almost were like, my dad was like, I thought it was kind of inappropriate, and your mom did too. I was like, well, there's some, it's meant to be ironic, blah 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 blah, and so hopefully they picked up on it. But yeah, I was surprised that specifically on Twitter took off.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird space, Twitter, to be funny because, especially with irony, like people obviously love sarcasm on Twitter, but it's when it's like really about being mean to somebody. That's when sarcasm really explodes on Twitter. But a joke like that, where you're not making fun of anybody and you're just being ironic about the position you're in, and it's if it's making fun of anybody, it's opportunists who
Right.
who try to get some personal gain from it.
Well, myself a little bit, to be totally honest. There is like sort of this. The target is definitely people who do kind of exploit situations like that for personal gain, but also almost myself a little bit, where there is a little bit of like, I did have people reach out. I had another joke that was actually to go on the same parallel, that was like, I've never connected more to my Black friends during Black Lives Matter than my like white acquaintances nervously texting me, are you okay with everything going on right now? And like, you do start getting a certain amount of attention, and you can't help as a human being, like, I'm not above it. I do comedy because I like attention. And so part of that joke was like almost half poking fun at the fact that I'm like, it's like, I don't know, it's both a joke and like, at least I'd have to, if I was to be totally honest, it's partially sincere in the sense that like, I want to do comedy. Whatever the reason is that somebody wants to book me, I'm happy to go and do a show. And so when I had some people reach out like, hey, you're Ukrainian, do you want to like do my show and speak on this or whatever? I was like, yeah, I'm not going to say no to that. I'm not a geopolitical expert by any means, nor am I, I was 7 years old when I came here, and I try to stay informed and talk to my parents. But also, if I'm being booked for a reason other than my comedy, you're sort of making a mistake, because you can probably get someone who's both a better expert on the political situation and somebody who's a more informed citizen of Ukraine.
No, it's interesting. And you also had another tweet, one that I liked, but did not get as much attention, which was, you got to hand it to Putin. He got everyone to stop posting about Wordle, which I thought was great. But that one doesn't go off, probably because people like talking about Wordle. You know what I mean?
Like, yeah.
People didn't want to like that because you were talking about them.
Yeah.
That's my theory.
And I think also people are, I mean, you could, there's definitely a few theories for why that tweet didn't work. Maybe it's just not as funny as you and I might think it is. That's the real hard truth. That's certainly possible. But also, I think people get, anything that starts with, you got to hand it to Putin. Maybe there's a greater bar for how much it has to hit for people to feel comfortable handing it to Putin, even though obviously that's a joke, and he's not.
Right.
Nowhere in his itineraries for invading Ukraine was people will stop tweeting about Wordle.
Yeah. You have a knack for comedy like that. I feel like you're very concise with finding a joke about something that maybe would be touchy with people. Just knowing you for years, whenever I see tweets, I'll think, gosh, that's such a good joke about something that people maybe don't want to talk about, or an aspect of it that people don't want to address. How do you find humor in those areas with those subjects?
I think my approach, for starters, is to like have humility with whatever my personal opinion might be on the subject matter. I think whenever like my priority is to like I've even had jokes that I kind of like, but if it's a subject that I feel particularly strongly on and I feel myself trying to express my opinion in that joke, I still see it as like detrimental to whatever it is I'm trying to do as far as the joke goes. And I like doing, political stuff and anything like that where I feel like everyone could laugh at it. And I think part of that starts with kind of knowing the best version of people who feel differently about that particular topic, knowing the most like generous version of their point of view. Because I think if it's taking like a really shallow version of what conservatives might think about this subject or a shallow version of what liberals might think about it, it might be funny to the people that like super agree with it and really want to laugh at that view, but even then it ends up being a little bit more hacky or like a little more of a low-hanging fruit. Whereas if I can find something that both sides can laugh at, I know that that's in itself is almost a little bit of a cliche, but I feel like trying to have that goal does make it funnier because it forces you, if you do keep thinking about it, if it you eventually get somewhere that's more interesting to me than just trying to appeal to like whatever sensibility might agree with you.
Right. That is, I think, a hard thing to do. Obviously, there's like kind of having your finger on the pulse of how people are feeling and being able to get to the core of things is pretty, those are useful skills to being able to do what you're talking about. But at least in the Twitter space, it's pretty hard to put that stuff out there without someone misusing it sometimes
For sure.
or just completely misrepresenting it. I feel like I see that all the time now.
Inevitable for sure. I think the one defense I have is that I never tweet sincere opinions on anything. And so at the least, if somebody tries to misread it, I'll be like, just go through my timeline and find one thing where I was sincere. Go look at what it is that I'm trying to do and be honest with yourself. Is it at all possible that I was trying to sincerely state the thing you think you're misreading right now?
Right. Have you run into that where people are maybe holding your feet to the fire on something?
I don't think so. I've done some podcasts where similar to this, it's not all jokey, and I might have certain opinions on things. And I've gotten into like little arguments there, but even there, like I do live at the cellar or live from America rather, which is like one of the Comedy Cellar podcasts. And they'll have like a few comics on and they'll have a few like political experts or something like that. And so, my job is to be jokey there, but every once in a while I get a little bit out of my element and try to get into it. And I've certainly been taken to task for stuff I've been misinformed on, but I've also sometimes corrected somebody who should have been an expert on the subject who maybe wasn't the best on it. And I'm sure if somebody wanted to, the way people do with podcasts, scan through things that I've said there, they would find plenty of stuff to take me to task on. And so I'll worry about that if I ever get enough notoriety for for it to be worth it for someone to spend their time that way.
That is a weird activity that people are getting into, that when someone gets hired for a show, so then someone starts going through the LexisNexis or whatever to find everything they've said on a podcast. And I'm like, what? You're just someone on Twitter. Why did you take the time to do that at all?
Because there's incentives. It's just responding to incentives, I think. And there's, you can get notoriety writing an article or writing a piece, and it's also easier. Some people are like, oh, this guy, where the fuck does he have time to spend all day? You can upload a bunch of podcasts now to transcription services, have it be transcribed automatically, and then control find whatever slurs or words that you need
Right.
to. Computers have made it a lot easier.
Right. That's true. It's just, I know that I just don't like, I guess, how disingenuous a lot of it can be sometimes when someone finds something and it's like, okay, it doesn't seem like you're bringing this up in good faith.
For sure.
And it gets to be sort of like, you don't maybe need to be the watchman here then on this subject if you don't actually care.
Yeah.
And I think there's some people who are also like, well, I go to comedy clubs all the time and hear worse stuff and everyone laughs and no one gets upset. And so why are we complaining about this guy who did something as a joke. It just happened to be in front of everyone. Like, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that.
I mean, that's the thing with stand-up is, it's really it's really hard when you remove context to know what someone was doing up there, especially when, like, I've heard people describe, and they were like, and they said this, and everyone in the audience laughed. And it's like, well, what does that tell you? That everyone in that room is a horrible human being, or that perhaps they had a different way of looking at it? And then also adding context, how you mentioned on Twitter, there's like somebody clearly makes a joke and then someone like quote tweets it and is like, my grandma survives this genocide in this country and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, yeah, man, nothing is funny if you give the full context of like the pains of humanity next to the thing that someone obviously was like joking about and wasn't. You know what I mean? Like a huge part of humor is like finding laughter in painful things. And of course, if you fully bring up like, hey, you're joking about this, and I've actually spent 20 years suffering from this. And it's like, yeah, now it's not funny. You're right. Now that you said that, that joke is no longer funny, but it was just a second ago.
Yeah. It's obvious that there are a lot of different kinds of people who are taking in stuff, and like they could be in that room listening and all these different kinds of people are laughing. So obviously it's not like, someone makes a joke and it's just white supremacists in the room. And so they're laughing at the racist thing. And then there's one person who's not a white supremacist who's like, that's not the scenario.
Right. You didn't just walk upon a secret Klan show that you happened to get a ticket to. It's just Staten Island, man.
But it's, there are Democrats and Republicans in that room. There are libertarians in that room. There are politically agnostic people in that room. There are people all over the spectrum of whatever topic, and they're all laughing together. And I feel like maybe we can laugh together more if we just sort of acknowledge that.
For sure. I do think part of it, I mean, there's a lot of just like, for a complicated thing, there's a lot of very simple incentives in economics that I think contribute to it that are not that complicated. One thing I'll mention is really simply a lot of the people that have a very narrow perspective on what constitutes comedy that's morally okay, or comedy that's needs to be supporting particular points of views, come from an ecosystem where very few people pay to see comedy. And so you have people that have spent their entire time around UCB, around indie shows that are free. And when you see that, I think your entire perspective just maybe values what's happening up there less, even though you claim it's more. But I think the fact that you have a judge over the content, I think, is indicative that it's less. And it's because it's free. When you perceive something as free, you see it as having less value, in my opinion. Whereas if you go to some of these shows where people are doing the raunchy stuff and they're doing stuff that's more offensive potentially, a lot of it is just club shows where everyone paid money, and so now they want their money's worth and they want to have a good time. They're all getting drunk and they're just laughing at these subjects. And I've almost gone further to one end of it, where I used to have the perspective that like, well, any subject is okay to joke about as long as it's like a smart, really unique, poignant take. And I've been to enough comedy clubs where that's not true. People will laugh at the dumbest shit about the worst subjects. And some of those jokes, as jokes, if you were to write them down and read it, I'd also have very little respect for those jokes. But at the same time, some of the comics that do those jokes are doing them in a way where in the moment they're working with the crowd, they're doing race jokes, they're doing sexuality jokes, they're doing gender jokes, and they're a performer. And so there's comics out there that are club comics that are maybe not doing as like intelligent writing as I would prefer, somebody else might prefer, but as comics, they're conducting the energy of a room in a way that's masterful. And that if you're in the moment and you actually want to laugh and you want to be a part of it, it's really fucking fun. And it's not the most brilliant stuff. And I won't name, but I do it. It's funny because there is someone specifically in my head at a show at Stand Up New York, a woman who was doing like, rape jokes and like pedophilia jokes and stuff. And single-handedly, I'm just watching her destroy. And I'm like, if you told me those jokes on paper, I would be like, yeah, that's hacky as shit. Like, I have no, like, you need to do something smarter than that for this material. But then watching it and watching everyone enjoy themselves, I'm like, no, these people are here to like not have these types of conversations, not be overly cerebral or like intellectualize what it is that you're actually saying underneath it.
Right.
It's a really interesting thing because there's the argument that comedy can be really powerful and challenge things, and that's true. And at the same time, it can be fucking nonsense that you laugh at in a room and leave and tell your friends once in a while, remind yourselves of that time you saw that show, you know?
I tend to agree with that because, I like John Oliver's show and I like Seth Meyers and they're saying stuff that I think, I'm laughing and then I'm also going, that was a good point. At the same time, I don't think it has big picture impact. But also at the same time, I don't only want that kind of stuff. And I also have grown to hate people looking at the underlying, what are they really trying to say? Like with this joke, they are really belittling these people and they're punching down when really that's not what they were doing at all. They weren't punching down. They were just like being silly. Or they just weren't talking about what somebody was saying they were talking about. There was no underlying point whatsoever. And they just completely misunderstood. And I hate just the like reading into it stuff that goes on.
For sure. Also, that context, it's funny because everyone has such a different context, like a room in Brooklyn versus a room in Texas is going to have a really not just a different idea of like the culture and the shared ideals and what's funny and what's not, but also like who is like the term like people use like punching down as if it's static regardless of where you are can be a thing that changes so much. I remember there was one particular, I did an open mic in Brooklyn and this guy did like a gay voice at the mic in a joke and the joke bombed and most of his set didn't go great in general. But then like a comic or two after him, somebody went up and just started railing on this guy who was like in his like mid to late 40s doing an open mic in Williamsburg. And the guy, and he heard, worst case scenario, he is tone deaf enough to not realize that the joke's bombed and will continue bombing. But more than likely, he heard that his bit bombed. And this guy is just like, this gay guy who went up after him is just like, you old fucking homophobe, blah, 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 just using his set instead of being funny to just rail against this guy. And then somebody else in the audience actually was kind of like, all right, like easy. He was just like trying to do a joke that didn't go well. And then he called that guy a homophobe too, and just really started railing off. And then I went up afterwards. I ended up getting an applause break, not to toot my own horn, because I was basically like, bro, like he bombed. He heard he bombed, but like, let's be frank, like we're not in Alabama. This is Williamsburg. It is literally easier to be gay here than in your late 40s. Like you're using your podium to bully this guy because in your mind, there's this permanent power dynamic where a white guy in his late 40s, even at a mic where everyone just watched him bomb, somehow holds power over you. But really, you're just a bully. Like in any other world, this situation, like in another state, whatever it is, like the situation would be flipped in some way and you would find some other way to bully because that's clearly your goal here. You just got what you think is a pass. You got an excuse. You saw it. You saw him bombing and you pounced. And it's like,
yeah,
that doesn't make a joke. That's for damn sure. But also like, it just emphasizes the fact that these aren't, especially on Twitter, like these things aren't so static. Everyone has a very different system that they're looking at these things through.
No, I've definitely seen I've even experienced bullying from people that I like socially agreed with, but like there was one person, I won't say who they are, but there's one person I'm thinking of. Both of these people actually had a lot of clout and followers, but one of them really has a lot of clout. Yeah. Let's go back though to your life and how you get, because you've done a ton, and apparently you've even been a Russian conductor. That's a joke because there's a Boris Khaykin who is a Russian
There is.
conductor.
We're in a battle for the top Google results, neck and neck. This motherfucker's dead, and I'm still competing with him neck and neck.
And while you are very neck and neck, let me show you this picture. If you Google you, there's a picture of you, but it says Russian conductor under the name.
Wow. Yeah, the wires get crossed sometimes. They do. That happened. I think there was a Wikipedia thing like that too at one point. Well, at least my face is beating out his. That means that he might be more accomplished, but he's also uglier. So how about that? There, Boris Khaykin. They want to see my face while listening to your music. I am his or he is my Cyrano de Bergerac.
So while you haven't done conducting, you have done all these other, I mentioned it earlier, directing, writing, stand-up, and you were in North Coast doing hip-hop improv. I don't know how you do so much so well. How are you doing all of these things on the level that you're doing? Where did it begin for you? Have you just been performing since you were young?
Well, first, thank you. I appreciate that. When I was young, I think I was just like kind of goofy and I did skits with friends and stuff. And then I guess I did like improv in high school. And it wasn't until I came to New York and was kind of like doing stuff at UCB where I was like, oh, this is not just like a hobby. This is a thing that you can really like build into something. But yeah, I don't know. I think part of it, I always feel like I need to step it up with certain things. And so I have like periods of time where I just invest the bulk of my efforts into one specific thing maybe, and then go back to juggling stuff and then invest into another. And so I have like little spurts of growth in each of those. But yeah, otherwise, I don't know. It's hard to answer that because I always feel like on a subjective level, if I try to compare myself, I'll always find somebody who I can be like, wow, I need to step my game up, And so part of it is just trying to constantly compare myself to people that I admire so that I'm not, comfortable with where I'm at.
What came first for you with all of these different endeavors? I guess you didn't start with directing, but was it stand-up? Was it acting? Like what did you first start doing?
Well, the first thing really that I started doing was I was doing like guitar comedy. Basically, I listened to a bunch of like Stephen Lynch in high school and, your Weird Al and all that stuff. I used to write like song parodies on the school bus and stuff. And then when I came to New York, I started doing some open mics and I was actually doing like a series at Stand Up New York that was at the time like sort of a reality show meets musical comedy series where they had a bunch of comics or musical comics, and you would get a subject and you'd have to do 10 minutes of new material every week on that subject. And I think I came in second and David Carl came in first as a character. And we've been really good friends ever since. Was doing that. And I found it easier to fill the time by doing some jokes in between. And also there was a comic in Jersey at the time who was booking me a little bit and with the guitar comedy stuff, who also was kind of like, you should try leaving the guitar at home. And it was sort of like a bunch of things happening at once where like I was really enjoying doing just jokes. I came to sort of the epiphany that I didn't sing well enough to be a musical comedian. And a lot of the musical comedy that I admired was really good musically. And I realized that not only is it also just better to listen to, but it's actually funnier. Like Stephen Lynch, love him or hate him or in between, has a really nice voice.
I want to speak to you now about something very serious, and that's the subject of race and racism. I've been seeing this girl lately. We have some differences between us when it comes to the subject of race, and so I felt like I needed to sit her down and explain my views to her. Have a seat and listen. Please don't say a thing. I only like black girls, the brown girls, the cafe au lait. If you are Nubian, I want you to be in every fantasy. But if you're a whitey, say 90-90 or do la 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 la.
And so when he does some of the songs where he's being subversive or he's just singing dumb, dirty shit or whatever, it's funnier because it's more ironic to have that coming from somebody who's taking themselves seriously as a musician. And when I would listen back, no matter how much I tried and I spent time practicing the way I do with everything else, there's a limit to how well I can sing. And that being a factor and just enjoying doing jokes and realizing I can get more laughs per minute, and it felt better being able to just do setup punchline rather than sometimes, the best musical comedy has a lot of jokes, but you're still stretching it out over this period of time. You can have a whole 3-minute song that's just a few jokes. That's still a solid work of art, but it's not quite the same as in those 3 minutes, you can fit a whole lot of punchlines if you just have setup punchline and then, and a bunch of tags.
Right.
So that was first. And I started improv probably around that similar period. So
Okay.
I was doing improv, and I guess from improv, I did like musical improv still. And I really remember seeing there was Baby Wants Candy, but there was also I Eat Pandas, Eliza Skinner and Glennis McMurray, and they were awesome. And so I wanted to take Eliza's class at UCB. I met James and Doug from North Coast there, and I started doing North Coast. And then I really, wanted to do, I'm trying to do the short version of this whole thing, but I wanted to do stand up more and more. And I kind of had a great experience where I think I skipped not all, but a good portion of some of the agony of doing open mics because I was already involved in the New York improv scene. And there was a lot that was really the UCB boom where people were doing a lot of independent shows. And I'd also met a lot of people who were really great to me and gave me stage time. But that in combination with all the independent shows where I would just hit people up and be like, if you want to host, if you need somebody to host, if you want to stand up just to change the pace of your show. So I did a lot of that in place of some of the more painful mics in New York. And that helped me. There was a couple years where I was doing multiple shows a night, just one show set after another. And I didn't have to do it at mics, which, you have, when you have no other choice, you have to practice on stage, but it can be kind of brutal, especially a lot of New York mics at that time. There was just a lot of scenes. There was a lot of people where it was really am I accomplishing something? It feels like everyone's here to laugh at themselves and their friends. And if I don't have a circle, you know how it is.
That's why I stopped doing stand up here.
It's tough. It's really, especially, I don't know what the mic scene is like now, but it takes time to find a few. And even then, sometimes you find a few mics where you think you really love it and you realize they're not preparing you for other stuff at all, because you did find your crew, and that's nice, but it's also just you and your friends laughing at each other.
Right.
It's not a great representation.
Right. There was a mic I liked in Gowanus that I don't think is up now, but it was at Freddy's, and I liked going to that one. Because
that's a great
everyone
room.
was paying attention, and no one there knew me, and they were paying attention. And I didn't know if they knew anyone else, but they were paying attention to everyone else. So it was nice.
Yeah.
But any other mic, it was no one paying attention to you. The host is barely paying attention. It's they're giving you less time than they're giving others. It's sort of I don't know what's hitting here. I can't tell because no one's paying attention.
Yeah. And sometimes it's almost counterproductive in the sense that I've had some periods where I wasn't doing as many mics anymore, but I had a set that I needed to prepare for something. And I was okay, I got 3 booked shows, but I really want to run this a couple more times. And so I'd go to a mic as well. And I would do the same 5 minutes that would kill for 3 actual shows. And then I would do a mic and most of it would bomb. And it's well, what's the takeaway there? Is it
Right.
that this stuff actually doesn't work? Is it that those 3 shows were flukes? Is it what, in my opinion, is the most likely thing, but no guarantee, that the people at that mic just happen to not be paying attention as much? And it's just a different context sort of for doing comedy. But the point is it gets you in your head, and you're just kind of now second guessing shit that you'd worked out and thought you were confident in.
Right.
It's almost like going to therapy, where you really have to be aware of whether it's productive or whether you're just telling yourself you're going and you're not actually accomplishing that much. unless you
Right.
do it with a particular mindset.
Absolutely. I want to talk a little bit more about the hip hop stuff because I've taken a hip hop class that you taught.
Yeah.
It was from the idea of, I guess, doing hip hop improv, but focus more on the rap part of it to teach people just how to do couplets and stuff.
Yeah.
Had you taken a class? Was that class that you took where you met James and Doug a hip hop class, or like when did you learn that if it wasn't a hip hop class?
Well, I'd been like almost in parallel with comedy, if maybe not before comedy. I would just freestyle at parties with friends and stuff since
Okay.
like also high school and college. And that was more just like a getting high or getting drunk thing and hanging out. And then in some of those musical improv classes, I would sometimes rap rather than sing. And there were also warm-ups that you would do where you would intentionally rap and do couplets because, part of musical improv is rhyming, not always, but, not always with hip hop either. But you would practice couplets and stuff. And I was always particularly good at those aspects at both like rhyming, but also kind of flowing, for a lack of better word, where you're not really singing, but you're doing something rhythmic and interesting, and you're doing it where, especially with comedy and musical improv, there's this kind of balance between having punchlines, and so you're pre-planning where you want to land in those couplets, and there's the flow, which is more the hip hop aspect, where you listen to some great hip hop, and if you really break down what they're saying, there's not, sometimes it doesn't even make that much sense, but it sounds awesome.
Yeah.
when you do that. And so there's a balance when you're doing musical improv and hip hop comedy where you want to hit those punchlines, but you also want that feel of flowing where it really, you don't just have an A, but you have these like little couplets and internal rhymes and things like that. But I guess basically just that I think Doug and I met. I'm not sure, was it James or Doug? Man, I really don't even remember, but it was definitely almost definitely one of Eliza Skinner's musical improv classes. And we would do hip hop. And then I think either Doug or James noticed that I was pretty good at that and that I had an interest in it and asked me if I wanted to join North Coast, which was really in its infancy at that period. And I think we were all like just kind of figuring out what it was going to be and whether enough people would have an interest in it.
Won't you please be my Valentine?
I love you.
Won't you please be my Valentine?
I love you.
Another holiday craze, Hallmark's the Pied Piper, but Cupid's still a baby who shits in his diaper. I ain't saying I ain't playing with a little romance, and I just don't need to force the 14th to get in no pants. Ladies know I flow all year, ain't no need to panic.
That's cool. You did that for several years, and then you started focusing more on stand-up, and you have been able to do a lot of shows and stand-up. And is that because you had built up enough of a name for yourself that you were able to get sets at the Stand? How do you get in? Is it knowing someone, or is it building a name for yourself?
Well, I wouldn't even say I'm in at the Stand. That's for sure. I had a show running there without getting too into the weeds, but like I'm not past there as far as like doing house shows. Everyone's going to give you a different answer because there's kind of a different path towards all of these things. And you can get sets at a club because you've been hanging out there a lot and they get to know you and you've done enough shows of the produced shows where they start booking you. You can get sets at the club because you got to walk on roll on a sitcom that's enough for you to sell some tickets with your name on it and everything in between. And so I did audition and get passed at the Cellar, but I've only done one spot there since getting passed because there's so much competition at the Cellar that, it's a long list and stuff.
Even with multiple rooms. Yeah. It's
four rooms now. Yeah.
Yeah.
But, when you have Chappelle and Chris Rock dropping by, it's a lot. And I have granted less. I don't have a late night set and I don't have, I'm not the ideal person to answer the question of how to get into these clubs because there's an old expression of like, don't take advice from somebody who's not in a place where you want to be. And so I have certain things that I've booked, and most of it, and most comics will say the same, is just through years of networking and doing well at a show and having a person want you back and having someone else see you do well. And it's pretty slow. And then all of a sudden, sometimes someone sees you who books something important. And they're like, okay, can you do this thing?
Yeah.
So I've accumulated through the years various credits, some of which sound better than they are, and some of which are better than they sound, that have helped book certain stuff. And I will say, as of late, I feel pretty, because it was an emotional roller coaster with like really being excited that I passed in my audition at the Cellar and then not getting spots for a while. It can be a little bit of a head fuck, you know. And I kind of, once I got over that part, I started just doing more stuff outside the city, and I got connected with some bookers and things like that, where I started leaving and going to, like, I was in Asheville a couple weeks ago. I'm in Savannah this weekend, and that gives me the opportunity to do a 40-minute set, which is like, A, you don't have a lot of opportunities to do that in New York, and B, it's like a very different pace, and it's a much better pace for confidence building in some ways, if you can fill that time where you can be patient and you don't have to like, oh my God, if I don't do this in the next 5 minutes, like that's it. I will have, you know, or 10 minutes or whatever. That's the end of my set. Whereas in a 40-minute set, you can really like get to know the audience and take them to more interesting places and stuff, and really work certain muscles that, like, I mean, you can do shows in New York, and unless you're a headliner where you can, you know, just book a club in a weekend and sell it out, you're never going to be able to do that.
Right. Did you do warm up for Jordan Klepper's The Opposition?
I did, and then it got canceled like almost right after. Nothing to do with me.
Right. I went to that, like, to them tape that like 3 times before you were doing it.
I only did it once. Also,
I fully missed it.
Yeah. Well, no, they had a regular person for a while, and then I forget if that person quit or left, and they were auditioning. And so someone recommended me to audition. And then I don't think they even ended up hiring anybody because they got canceled before they did it. But like a few of us did it. And it's a very different experience, by the way. It's an awesome gig to have. It pays pretty well. It doesn't take up a lot of time. It's cool, but it is very different from doing stand-up. And I know stand-ups who end up not being happy and spending more time than they want to in a gig like that, and then leaving. And it's hard, because if you're a comic and you're just struggling to make ends meet, you're like, oh, this bastard, like, what a gig. But if you're somebody that's been doing that for a while, eventually, like anything else, you take it for granted a little bit, and like, it is different. You're not going to be doing the same jokes. You might do a couple jokes, but a lot of it is kind of like more cheerleadering than jokes. And a lot of, you know, if you're a stand-up and you go to watch one of those shows and you see somebody do warm-up, I mean, you've seen it. It's kind of, it's more pumping everybody up and make sure that you're going to get the reaction from the crowd than it is.
And everyone
about
does it
you.
so differently.
That's true. Also, yeah.
There's a lot of crowd work on a like Seth Meyers guy. When I saw him, I don't know if he's still there, and Colbert's guy both did a lot of crowd work, and that is, it probably keeps it fresh for them to be able to just do a bunch of crowd work,
right?
And also gets the crowd going. And then there's all the like business stuff that they have, like all of them have to do, regardless of what show. And that some of what people get frustrated with, is like having to do all that business, the business side of like, all right, you got to laugh, you got to don't do this, don't do that.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. And I guess, like you said, it depends on your approach to it. But I think if you're somebody who's like, the type of comedy you like to do is like subversive or about like particular things, like, you're not really going to do any of that. You're not really trying to get people, especially you're not trying to get people in a mentality where they're like ready for more edgy humor than that show is going to give them, you know? So you want people to be pumped to laugh at stuff in the style of Seth Meyers. You can't have like Anthony Jeselnik come out and do his work as a warm-up for Seth Meyers, you know?
Right. Yeah, good point. Jeselnik used to write monologue jokes for Fallon, and his style of humor was, you know, kind of too mean, for lack of a better term, than what is Jimmy Fallon's delivery system.
Too mean and too humorous.
Like, apparently they liked his jokes. They just were like, I can't do those jokes.
Yeah, and I mean, also he's a brilliant writer, so I have no doubt he can write stuff in the voice of that show if he needs to. But I can see how that would feel, a little bit like handicapping himself for it or something,
Yeah, he's talked about that, and it was nothing against Fallon because he liked Fallon. It was just I can't do my thing here so much. I know what they're doing, so I'll do that. But then he just did it for a couple of years max. I think. I don't think he did it much longer than that.
It was a good career stepping stone for him.
Yeah, this has been a great chat. We didn't get to talk much about like your short films or at all about your short films. Maybe what we could do is talk about how you put together, write and direct a short that you've made.
Sure.
Like what is the process? Like, how do you, for you?
Well, so the background there for starters was that's just the thing I started doing where eventually it felt like I was relying on other people for opportunities outside of stand-up to like be in stuff or make stuff. And so I just started filming sketches. And I do have a piece of advice there for sure, which is to not be above learning aspects of production. I think I personally have been guilty of it. And I've seen people who are just like, oh, I just need somebody to film this sketch for me. And it's good to find people to collaborate with, but it's also good to not feel like something is too daunting or that you should expect or feel entitled to somebody else wanting to work on your brilliant ideas. There's just too many people who feel they have their own brilliant ideas to jump on yours and be that eager to do it. And I've had that perspective a little bit. I've been guilty where I've underestimated just exactly what it is you're asking for someone when you want them to edit your comedy sketch or whatever it is. You're asking for a lot of hours on a thing where, especially if it's a free collaboration, you really want somebody to feel ownership and to be passionate about whatever it is. Mm-hmm. And so I learned to edit off YouTube basically, and now I pay the bills a lot with that, and that's gotten me directing gigs because I can also edit the stuff I direct, and I often prefer to do that. And so I think with the sketch, and I guess people do whole classes and stuff to learn how to make good sketch, but I think a big part, and you'll hear this from a lot of people with sketch, and I've made a lot of sketches, and I think for starters, don't underestimate what a value. I was going to say this. I was going to say don't underestimate the value of like good production. And you'll hear that pretty often. And I've heard it at like there's like these short film festivals that they have in New York where people submit sketches and stuff. And audio quality is a huge issue all the time. Because video quality can sometimes be a creative choice. Like you can be satirizing something that isn't. If you're satirizing something that looks like an HBO show, you want it to look like an HBO show. If you're satirizing something that looks like a clip like of Central Park Karen and you're doing your own, you can film it on your phone and that's what it looks like. But when you have bad audio quality, you can't really tell what's happening. Like you can, with bad video quality, you can still kind of discern it. But if there's supposed to be dialogue that's integral to just knowing what the concept and the humor is, and you didn't bother with like a proper audio setup, that's a big disservice. But the other half, the flip side of that is kind of what I just said, where, the current sketch group on SNL, I think started with like TikTok videos.
Yeah. Do not destroy.
Yeah, guys, can we talk about last night?
Remember that girl I was talking to at the bar last night? The one I was like really gelling with?
Yeah.
Looked her up on Facebook. Turns out she's Casey Anthony.
No.
Should I message her?
Did I get a tattoo last night? What in the fuck? Spring Break Colonial Williamsburg 2037?
Last night I found myself walking down the sidewalk just like pushing two gorgeous Italian twins in a double wide stroller. I'm like, hi, whose kids are these?
Yeah, I think I'm pretty sure. And a lot of their stuff looks like that. They have that like kind of manic quick editing of just them on camera or whatever.
Yeah.
And so again, I have a little bit of a chip, I guess, advice wise, where like if I had, I've done a good amount, but I would feel more comfortable giving more advice with video if I had a successful TV show or something like that, you know? So everything with a grain of salt. But the part that I would say is just like make shit. There's such a, and I'm torn with this all the time too, where I have like pilots and things that I'm like, oh, I just got to get a meeting with the development company and blah, blah, blah. But in the end, like there's all the other shit with trying to survive by paying the bills with comedy and whatever other aspects. But in the end, nothing feels better to me than like conceptualizing a sketch and having it out there. It just feels good to go from concepts to execution. And if you just focus on the small ideas that you're actually capable of executing, it's really satisfying. It's maybe not as satisfying as getting a TV show that you can then like buy a house with or something, but there's something pretty satisfying about just putting a sketch on YouTube and being able to share it and like learning from that and watching it. And really important, obviously, be honest with yourself, like sit down and watch somebody watch it. And if they didn't laugh, don't be like, well, they laughed in their head or whatever else, or they, or at the end where they're like, no, it's pretty funny. You know, watch them for their honest reaction. And if they don't laugh, see what it is. Because sometimes the joke was still good and you just needed to do something different in the execution. See what it is that's different between how you imagined it and what somebody's watching and what you're maybe still adding with your imagination that makes it funny to you, but not as funny to them or whatever it is, you know?
That's great advice, I say. Don't sell yourself short. You're very talented, so people can definitely take this advice with more than a grain of salt.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Take it with, I don't know, like whatever you fit under your fingernail of salt.
Well, there it is, Boris. Thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, man. It was great to see you.
Look, he is solid, so you can take his advice. If you want to see him perform and you're in New York City, you can. He's going to be live at Caveat this Monday, the 21st at 7 p.m. on a show called Immigrant Jam. If you're not in New York City, you can see him on Zoom on Monday at 8 p.m. on a show with Judah Friedlander called Chirping Bird Comedy. Look up at Chirping Bird Comedy on Instagram and Facebook for details. Cool that people are still doing online shows. We have links in the bio for all of this, including ways to support the Ukrainian relief effort. Links will be easier to view on our website blog for this episode. Go to thereitispod.com. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at thereitispod, and subscribe to our YouTube channel at thereitis, and follow me on Twitter at JasonFarJokes and Instagram at JasonFarPics. Until next time, be good to each other.
The music for the theme song was created by Neil Brooks. The rap was written and performed by Nick Acevedo. The logo for There It Is was created by Jeff Prater. The There It Is podcast is produced by Jason Farr.